Now I'm going to show you how you can use the blanket stitch for attaching an applique. And after that I will use that as a starting point for another bit of work with the honeycomb stitch. The blanket stitch is very fit for attaching appliques, and I have here a bit of eco-printed linen, and I'm going to place that here in the middle. And it can be just any bit of fabric, it can be a bit of felt, a bit of cotton, it doesn't matter. And I've cut out a circle, but it can also be a leaf shape, a shell shape, whatever you like. And I'm going to pin the applique to the linen, and I have my background fabric, and I'm going to use the embroidery hoop. And in this case, I think I'll use the orange thread because I think that contrasts nicely with the applique and you will be able to see it. So, a knot. And I'm going to do a circle with the blanket stitch. It is very much like this circle. And I hope you can remember that when you do that with your right hand, like I'm going to do now, you start at the top or anywhere else, that doesn't matter much, but you go anti-clockwise. While when you're doing this with your left hand, you go clockwise. And I come up just at the edge of the applique. And now I'm going to attach it. I go through 2 layers here and make my first rather small blanket stitch. I'm using small stitches because, well, you can use bigger stitches if you like, but I want the blanket stitch to be just a way to fixate the applique and not be an element within the applique itself. So, continuing to do blanket stitches. And at first there's actually nothing special about it. I think I can take out this pin now. But as you continue, there's an aspect of the blanket stitch that is actually very helpful in attaching an applique. And that is that you can, when you go down with your needle, you can pull a little bit, just a tiny bit on the applique, move it outward a little bit, and then make your stitch. And at first that's not really important. But the further you go, the more helpful that becomes for making the applique nice and taut. So when you go through just that first layer, just the applique with your needle, just the point of your needle is going in, and then you pull slightly towards the outside. It's just a minor movement. And as you can see, this linen that I use is a very easy fabric. It will lie flat anyway, but especially with thinner fabrics or fabrics that have a little bit of stretch, getting an applique to lay nice and smooth on your background can be difficult, and the blanket stitch is very helpful in that way. And especially once I get to the opposite side of the bit that I have already attached, this is certainly going to help. I can now take out that second pin. I'm pulling just a little bit, pulling the fabric, the applique, a little bit to the outside. Not so much as to place a lot of tension on the fabric, but just enough to make it nice and taut. That is something that the blanket stitch can do. That will be is not so much the case with other stitches like back stitch that you can also use to attach an applique. And as you can see, I use an applique without tucking under the edge. I could do that, but it's not necessary with the blanket stitch because it goes all around, and because it has this line on the outside, it will help to prevent fraying of the applique. And that's also a plus side of the blanket stitch. That it gives an outside line here that will help to prevent fraying. Each time just a tiny millimeter, half a millimeter to the outside. And as you can see, it makes the applique really smooth. Nearly there. And one last stitch. Then I come up at the exact same spot where I came up for the first stitch. And I close this circle. And I can go down directly outside of that stitch. And I have a really nice round way of fixating my applique smoothly. And it can also be, as I said, the start of using the honeycomb stitch. And I'll do that by coming up here, and that's in between two of these stitches. And now I go with my needle under this part of the stitch and put it slightly to the outside, and make the first stitch of the second round. And I continue to do that. And like with what we did here, I'm making a few variations. So here I'm skipping a stitch and making a bigger stitch. And here I'm going to make 2 stitches, but I'm going to let the stitches grow longer. And smaller again. Skipping 2 stitches. So a mix of smaller and bigger stitches. And each time the spokes of the stitches are more or less pointing towards the center of the applique. Now I'm going to make the last stitch with this thread and going down exactly outside, just outside the corner of that last stitch. Oh, the thread has escaped the eye of the needle. And I need a new bit of thread. And I come up, I went down to end this thread just outside of that last stitch, and I come up just inside the corner of that last stitch. So it looks like the thread is continuing in exactly the same way. And bigger stitch here too. And each time I can check with my needle if I'm still pointing the stitches more or less towards the center of the applique. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you can stop every now and then and think, does this still look good? And I'm nearly all the way around, so I have some curves here. So what would I want for this last bit? Going smaller, and then maybe one curve here. So that's good to look at how far have I gone and what do I want to happen in the rest of this round. So small stitches here. And one other time making another curve. This will is one of the things that you can do to give a bit of an organic look to the hole by not making all the stitches the same size, but by varying their size. And the last stitch of this round. And I think it might be nice to do the next round with a different color. So I'm going to end this thread here. And now I will take, let's say, green, because that will match the applique. And I think for the second round, the second row, I'm going to show you that you don't have to make a complete round. Now I can come up everywhere I like. This circle is closed, so I come up, let's say, here, and I want to make a few short rounds that accentuate these curves. I could do the other way around. I could make short rounds here, just in between the curves. But I think I like the first option better, and it means that if I'm doing incomplete rounds, I do that thing where I come up just outside of the stitch, go with my needle under that part of the orange stitch, and start making a short row. And here, of course, I have this big stitch, and that I always really like to give a bit of a rounded shape on this side. And I'll keep it really short and already go down here in this first stitch after the big stitch. And come up here before this big stitch. Again, come up just outside that stitch. Pick up this part of the stitch, the orange stitch, my needle, and pull that slightly towards the outside. Filling in the big stitch with multiple smaller stitches. And now in the second row, you already can notice that the circumference of what I'm doing is a lot bigger than with the first one, where I attached the applique. So I will in fact need more stitches to go round. And if I make just one stitch in the previous stitch, it's automatically a little bit bigger. And here I can do multiple stitches again. And this bit here, going down. And I have a curve here, and one here. And that makes 5 curves in total, and I think that's quite nice. I come up here. There's not much space between these bits, but you can see the effect of not making a complete row, but dividing it in smaller bits. Going down here. And you can already see that by doing this, I'm kind of exaggerating the curves that were created in the first round. And I'll start here just before this bigger stitch. And this is going to be a rather long curve and then a short one there. So I haven't thought of this beforehand, and I have to adapt myself to the circumstances, to the things that I come across while stitching. And then I have to think, how do I want to tackle this? What do I want to do? And in this case, I'm going to skip 2 stitches, so that I also have a bigger stitch here. I'll do 2 stitches in this stitch. And there's only a little bit of space between these curves, so I'm going down here in this corner of the stitch and coming up again in the other corner of the same stitch, so that I have a clear end to this bit and a clear start. They're very close together. And in this row, I'm letting go a bit of the directionality of the stitches. It looks good if they are still more or less directed towards the center of the applique, but they have their own curves now, their own little circles that they move around. So the dynamic of the stitches and their direction is changing a little bit when we get farther from the applique center. And I'll end this here. Yes, this looks nice. And perhaps what color shall I use for the next row? And I'm also going to think, what do I want to do? There are a couple of things that I still want to show you. And I think I'll do one more row here, and then a last row with small stitches and with something extra spikes. But for now, I think the brown thread. And again, in the next round, I have the choice of using the brown thread to even out the curve, so filling these valleys, you could say, with big stitches, doing small stitches on the tops of these hills, and that way evening out the curves and coming to a more or less circle again. But I do like these curves, so I think I'll choose the other option and accentuate the curves even more. And that means that I can also show you what happens if you come to such a valley like this that forms a bit of a point. And it doesn't matter where I start. I can start here, for instance. And I want to accentuate the curve, so do a rather big stitch, because I'm going to make this a whole round again with the brown thread. And then I'll close up this, start this beginning of this round when I come and I've gone round completely. And as I said, the further we come from the middle, the more stitches we need, because the circumference is growing. And now I'm going with my stitches around this little hill, so to speak. And here I'm making only small stitches, and perhaps also skipping a stitch here or there. So now I'm going into this, the orange, the green bit of the new hill. And as you can see now, my stitches aren't pointed towards the center of the applique at all, but more pointed towards the center of this rounded bit, this curve or hill. And I keep, in this round, I can keep varying between bigger and smaller stitches. But I let them grow smaller again. And I come to the valley and I make them a bit longer here on top so that I accentuate the curves. And working my way to the top of the next hill. Just stitching intuitively, seeing what comes up, but with a bit of a plan in mind, is to accentuate the curves. And for instance, now I skip this stitch here and go immediately to this stitch, so I can go up and work around the next curve. And I don't think I'm gonna get all around on this one thread. So you see where one length of thread, an arm length of thread, was plenty to do this very first round, even with the rather small stitches rather close together there. The further outside we get, you also need more thread for one round. And certainly not with these big stitches. Yeah, I can do one more, I think. And then make my last stitch with this thread here. Go down just outside to the corner. Get the orange thread out of the way. Do another knot on top of the last one, just to be sure. And I can cut the thread. And I'll need a new bit of brown thread. Doesn't have to be very long because I'm nearly there. So coming up, now this time just inside the corner of the stitch. And I can continue. Making a big stitch here. And this is a very steep valley. So I think that I only can do one stitch here in the middle. And then start on this side, and as you can see, these 3 stitches that I've now made here come together very, very close here on the outside. So I adapt to the curves and the shapes that I encounter. Coming up exactly where the round began and going down outside of that, and my round with brown is finished. Now the last round that I'm going to make does look a bit like a bit of plankton floating in the ocean, I think. And I'm going to give that to return to the green color. Now I'm going to make, as you can expect, this last row with small stitches, but I also can add something extra. And I'm going to add spikes, like this little organism has hairs or whatever you would like to call them on the outside. And I'll come up here halfway this curve. That's actually a bit divided now in 2 curves. And work my way to the top of this one, and of course do multiple smaller stitches in this bigger one. But I'm also going to do a spike, and for that I'm going to make a stitch here. And now I'm changing direction like we did with going up and going down. And I'm going to make a stitch in the other direction. And I'm going to make it in this stitch. And another one here. I'm going to change direction again and picking up this first stitch. And picking that up again here by pushing this part to the side like I I'm used to doing with a honeycomb stitch. And now end with one stitch here in the middle in a point. To adjust with my needle a little bit. The tension of that last one. So, and as you can see, I have made a bit of a spike. Just going to the edge of my embroidery hoop and going down there. And this way of going in very, very short rows in different direction, it's in fact also called the ladder stitch or sometimes the open chain stitch. Now I'm going to back to the rounds and picking up here on the inside the corner of this stitch so that I can continue my rounds. And I'll make another spike here. First, a stitch like this, and I'll make this one a bit smaller, just one stitch. And now going in the other direction by going down in the corner of this stitch, going straight up. And now when I pull on this stitch, a bit of a triangle appears, but I can pull that triangle open. That is exactly what you do with the open chain stitch, and make it a bit square, as you can see. So by pulling on this corner, I open up that triangle and make it a square. And now I'll do the last point, so that not all spikes are equally big. And there you have another spike. To sound a bit like that spiky virus that bothered us for so many years. But a lot of organisms have these kinds of hairs. This could also be a cross-section, microscopic cross-section of a flower stem, for instance. That sounds much more friendly. Let's say that this is the cross-section of a stem, and you know that some flowers have these hairy stems. So this is a flower stem, and we're going to give it some hairs. And now in such a narrow corner as here, I just skip these stitches and go immediately to this stitch. So I'm kind of closing up that corner. There's no space to do more stitches in this narrow corner. So let's do another spike, a somewhat bigger stitch to start with, changing the direction, and now making a stitch in this corner. And at first you get a triangular stitch, but now I'm pulling on this bit and opening up that. Make another stitch that I again open up, and now by pulling on this side. and also give this one a point. Going down and continuing by coming up in this corner. And I'm going to divide my spikes a bit unevenly around this stem. And now I'm making only a very small one. So I'm changing my direction, but now I'm just immediately making the point of the hair. So this is just a small one. And continuing the round. And filling in all the big stitches that I might encounter with multiple smaller ones. And again here we have a very narrow corner, and I could do a lot of little stitches here, but I won't. And just hop over, jump the ravine, as you could say, to the other side of the hill, other side of the valley, and continue there. Now let's do a slightly bigger spike hair again, a bit like the first one. So one that has more stitches at its base. So I'm changing direction and doing stitches in the other direction. And again, you see that this first stitch has a bit of a triangular shape, and I'm going to open that up later. But I'm going to do one, well, let's say 2 stitches more. And now changing direction again and doing 2 stitches. And for the second one, I open up this first stitch. Changing direction again, and now I did 3 stitches here, 2 stitches here. Now I'm just going to make 1 stitch by opening up that first stitch, opening up this 1 stitch by pulling on this corner. I did make this one a little bit too tight, so I'm going to pull that loose a bit so that there's not so much tension on the stitch, and that gives me room to open up this stitch and make the last point of this rather large hair. And I've also come to the end of my thread. Now I hope I've shown you enough about how these spikes work, and it's going to take me quite some time to finish this round, and I think I will not make a video of that, but I hope you have seen enough to continue yourself making a couple of spikes here and there, and then later I will show you the result. So I have finished the last round of this microscopic cross-section of a flower stem with hairs on the outside. And my sketch cloth, my sample cloth, is completely filled with all kinds of things that you can do with the blanket stitch. We started out with the blanket stitch as a hemming stitch in all kinds of variations with lines that curve, and the challenges you get when you letting the stitch curve, especially the danger of stitches collapsing. We addressed how you could use the blanket stitch in circles with the rays going outside like a flower or sun motif, and going inside more like a wheel, for instance. To superimpose two rows like it was a zipper to fill the shape with blanket stitches, the knotted blanket stitch, how you can change direction and let the spokes point at any direction that you want, and finally the honeycomb stitch variation, where you in fact use all the things that you have learned here. And lastly, the blanket stitch for attaching appliques and for working outside, letting an organism grow with the honeycomb stitch, complete with hairs on the end. Well, this is the basis. There's more that you can do with the blanket stitch, but that is in fact all a variation on what I have shown you here. I hope you enjoyed making this sketch cloth.